Passage to England, Part 3, Last Part. I was fortunate to land in Britain at a time of great churning. The 1960s are recognized as the happening decade in the country. The caricature of the British stuffy, reserved, insular, cold, unadventurous, obsessed with class, tradition, and heritage, unaware of foreign food, perilously close to the truth. A felicitous phrase, the establishment, was coined by the journalist Henry Fairley. The establishment in Britain consisted of the House of Lords, the editor of the Times, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Director General of the BBC. This centre right blimpish quartet pretty much ruled Britain and set the rules of the game. Ajad and I were walking along the Thames when I saw a flock of swans swimming in the river. They belong to the Queen, he told me, and warned that if I had any ideas of abducting them to make a nice swan curry, a heavy fine and 2 years rigorous imprisonment awaited me. I thought he was joking till we came across a notice threatening precisely the same consequences if Her Majesty's swans were harmed. There was a big churning in the arts, notably in the theatre. The angry young man had arrived to challenge the orthodoxies of the time. John Osborne's Look Back in Anger, first staged in 1956, aroused continuous debate and dissent on the role of the artist in post imperial Britain. His raging hero, Jimmy Potter's impassioned cry, "There are no good brave causes left to fight for anymore," immediately struck a chord. Britain had lost an empire and was floundering with no apparent national aim or purpose. John Osborne's Look Back in Anger and Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot languished for many years before they found producers willing to take the financial risk. However, when they were finally performed, they shattered forever the English middle class country house drama. My knowledge of Western music was nominal, although Cliff Richard's name, since he was an Anglo Indian from Lucknow, rang a bell. Fortunately, four obscure lads from Liverpool converted me to the joys of pop. In 1962, the Beatles produced their first hit, which announced the advent of Beatlemania, first in the UK and then all over the world. At one point, the Beatles were making so many dollars that they helped Britain's perennial balance of payments problem, which meant they kept the pound stable vis-a-vis the dollar. Prime Minister Wilson complimented the pop group for earning dollars for Britain, to which Beatle Ringo Starr replied, "Go to hell with Britain. We are earning dollars for ourselves." It has been suggested that after the empire, the BBC was Britain's gift to the colonies. In India, a whole generation has been brought up in awe of the BBC. The BBC accent in particular was worshipped. It was posh, formal, imperious, cultivated, common in highbrow circles in London. It came naturally to the ruling elite. Till the late 50s, it was compulsory for BBC newscasters to wear dinner jackets for reading the news. The BBC was ripe for picking, and the insurrection took place on Saturday, 24th November 1962. A serious satirical program which I was able to catch was seen on BBC television. It was called That Was the Week That Was, TWTWTW, and it outraged, shocked, and infuriated officialdom. The anchor, a bumpkin with the downmarket moniker David Frost, was completely at odds with the settled BBC style and ethos. He had funny hair, his tone was distinctly non BBC, and he was a toddler of 22 years. No one like him, or even close to him, had been seen on the mighty establishment mouthpiece. That was the week that was set out to create more than a storm in a teacup. It succeeded. The show flouted the convention that television should not acknowledge that it is television. TWTWTW made no attempt to hide its cameras, allowed the microphone boom. In this cultural and social whirlpool, I embarked on a course of self education. I had absolutely no idea of how I was going to even partially achieve the goal. All I knew was that I had to start at the bottom. Looking back, I have been able to identify four mentors that helped me on my way. One political weekly, one daily newspaper, two public libraries, and one fat Englishman. Precisely in what circumstances I lucked on Dennis Hill, I don't quite recall. He could have sought me out for two reasons. Dennis detested Englishmen. Dennis adored Indian food. He could spend hours describing the flavors and tastes of the unspeakable Madras curry. To him, Indian food began and ended with Madras curry. So, when I took him for a meal to the newly opened Quality in Warren Street, he had tears of pleasure in eyes as he ate his first sumptuous meal. Dennis was overweight and ugly and badly dressed. He was a die-hard socialist and a failed writer. He had a mountain of rejection slips from almost every publication in England, Scotland, and Wales. To earn a living, he became a draftsman for a firm of architects. Not surprisingly, he hated his job. Dennis introduced me to four writers: Kingsley Amis, John Brainy, J.B. Priestley, and the American Herman Wouk. Of the four, Kingsley Amis, then an angry young man, was his favorite. He presented me with a paperback of Lucky Jim, the most talked about novel of the 1960s. Dennis completely identified with its hero Jimmy Dixon, who, like him, despises the upper classes. For Dennis Hill, Jim Dixon was a role model who rebelled against the conventional British life. When I returned home, I kept in touch with Dennis for a while. I wrote to him and told him I had got a job editing an English monthly. Why don't such things happen to me? He lamented. Since I was starting right at the bottom in the pursuit of self education, I was on the lookout for reading material which offered more than news. It had to provide a point of view, put the news into perspective, explain what weight to attach to it. Raw data was necessary, but so was the attitude one had to extract from it. Because I was unable to do the attitude extraction myself, I needed a guide, a teacher. On 15th October, the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted. For 13 days, the US and the Soviet Union stood on the brink of nuclear war. Was Khrushchev justified in placing nuclear missiles in Cuba? Did I have a position on a dispute which threatened to blow up the world? Nelson Mandela sentenced to life imprisonment was big news. Was the punishment deserved? The biggest civil rights march comprising blacks and whites took place in Washington. What was my stand on civil rights? It was through the New Statesman that I first looked carefully for political commentary and soon recognized that analysis and reflection on somber and momentous issues could be lively and unconventional without being shallow or showy. Alan Watson and James Fenton had a huge fan following for their scintillating political columns. However, it was the back of the book, the literary and cultural section, which attracted anarchists, reactionaries, communists, freethinkers, and academics. To use a truism, the New Statesman back of the book was stimulating, sparkling, offensive, and sometimes it was silly. Libraries in Britain are ideal places for learning and snoozing. In the winter months, old and young folk flock to the library because it is welcoming and warm, which means it is centrally heated. I flocked to two, the Kingston and Surbiton libraries. All national newspapers, including the tabloids and periodicals, were available, and if memory serves me right, one could borrow three books at a go. I read the newspapers in the cozy comfort of the library and the books in my cramped bedsit. The first book I borrowed was Neeraj C. Chaudhary's A Passage to England. Several people have cast a spell on me. The few names I mention below belong to my London days and therefore cover a specific period. These luminaries influenced me not only by their work, they influenced me by the way they lived. I have tried to benefit from their wisdom. the expression of that wisdom and admired the consistency between what they preached and what they practiced. Top of the list is George Orwell. No question. What drew me to him was his integrity, unimpeachable 24 carat integrity. Arthur Koestler mentions Orwell's uncompromising intellectual honesty, which made him appear almost inhuman at times. Others called him the saint of common decency. His fidelity to truth was Gandhian. The anecdote I came across sealed my regard. When Orwell was literary editor of the Tribune, he would refuse invitations to book launch parties. He feared meeting the author socially might cloud his judgment on author's work. George Orwell and E.M. Forster were two ends of the pole. Forster famously hoped he would betray his country rather than his friends, while George Orwell was constantly betraying friends who supported or accepted dictatorship as a short term prize for achieving a cherished goal. Like most intellectuals of his day, he fell for the charms of communism and saw the Soviet Union as the embodiment of that noble idea. However, once he discovered the full horror of Stalinist rule in the Soviet Union, he, unlike others on the left, abandoned the Soviet Union and instead remained a socialist. Animal Farm and 1984 are savage attacks on the Soviet Union's descent from workers' paradise to one man tyranny. If you were a friend of the Soviet Union, you could not possibly be friend of George Orwell. No one has spelled out better than Orwell how corrupt writing produces corrupt societies and vice versa. In a stunningly original piece, Politics and the English Language, he argues the great enemy of clear language is insincerity. When there is a gap between one's real and declared aims, one turns instinctively to long words and exhausted idioms like cuttlefish squirting out ink. In our age, there is no such thing as keeping out of politics. All issues are political issues, and politics itself is a mass of lies, evasions, folly, hatred, and schizophrenia. When the general atmosphere is bad, language must suffer. I should expect to find that the German, Russian, and Italian languages have all deteriorated in the last 10 or 15 years as a result of dictatorships. But if thought corrupts language, language can also corrupt thought. As much as his non-fiction, I found George Orwell's personal life fascinating. It shed enormous light on the kind of person he was and the kind of writer he became. He wrote under the name of George Orwell, while his family name was Eric Blair. He loved practical jokes. He was miserable at school, and yet he was a especially happy child. He described his family as lower upper middle class. He was a heavy smoker. He died of TB at the age of 47. Rolling his own cigarettes from strong shag tobacco, he had Fortune and Mason tea delivered to him when he was fighting on the side of Republicans in the Spanish Civil War. He had little interest in food. He dressed like a bohemian. Interestingly, Orwell had a bewildering approach to social decorum. He expected his working class guests to dress for dinner, On the other hand, he slurped tea out of a saucer. Finally, despite his comfortable income, he was a miser, strictly rationing the heating in his damp, cold cottage on the island of Jura, a rationing which made his TB worse. I keep a handful books on my bedside table for nighttime reading. All of George Orwell's essays and journalism find pride of place in that collection. For 2 decades now, when I have returned home after a tense, crisis ridden day at the office, I dip into Orwell for half an hour. The reading works like a bomb. Decline of the English Murder, his thoughtful piece on Gandhi, which begins Saints should always be judged guilty until they are proved innocent, his original take on good bad books, his instruction manual for making a nice cup of tea are guaranteed stress busters for me. James Cameron, another old India hand and generally regarded as the best foreign correspondent of the 1960s and 70s, I respected because he had little formal education and began his journalistic career as a copy boy. He was the first Western journalist to report from North Vietnam. His knack of unobtrusively inserting himself in the stories he sent back appealed to me. Cameron's classic Indian Summer lies beside Orwell's essay on my bedside table. Graham Greene, like V.S. Naipaul, was a writer traveler. His novels were often set in poor, hot, and dusty tropical backwaters such as Mexico, West Africa, Vietnam, Cuba, Haiti, and Argentina, which led to the coining of the expression Greenland, desolate, dangerous places where treachery lurks. I did not know then that Graham Greene had championed R.K. Narayan even as he disliked India, mainly for taking over Roman Catholic Goa. In The Quiet American, he shows how high idealism is more dangerous than low statecraft. This anti imperialistic crusader lived most of his 86 years close to the edge, flirting with danger even with a game called Russian roulette. One of my influences came from across the Atlantic. Norman Mailer in the 1960s was an unavoidable presence. He helped create a genre, new journalism, in which the writer is also the center character of the narrative. His essay in Esquire magazine on John Kennedy, Superman Comes to the Supermarket, heralded the arrival of a fresh type of journalism. For me, Norman Mailer did some good, some bad. In the mid 70s, I was commissioned to write a biography of Meena Kumari. Mailer had just published Marilyn Monroe, which I read backwards. Stupidly, I tried to copy Mailer's style. The result was a disaster. One of the lessons Mailer taught me: influence, yes, imitation, no. A.J.P. Taylor was called the people's historian. It was by reading his lucid origins of the Second World War that I gained a correct picture of a demon called Adolf Hitler. Taylor portrayed him as a grasping opportunist rather than a ruthless dictator. Taylor helped me make some sense of World War II. One final influence: humor. This I obtained mostly through television and radio. Spike Milligan was born in Ahmednagar. One day, when I switched on the radio, Spike was describing his blissful childhood, his ayah, his house, and the early morning birds of Ahmednagar. In a stroke of genius, the BBC had actually sent a team to Ahmednagar to record the sounds of the birds. It was a compelling program. I have been a fan of Spike Milligan and his absurdities ever since. Tony Hancock, who committed suicide because of depression, was a rage when I was in England. His Hancock half hour on television would shut down the entire United Kingdom. He also shut me down. I would cancel all engagements to catch the Wednesday 8 p.m. show. I was not fully switched on to all the nuances of humor since this was archetypal British comedy, but a Lucknow lad reared in an environment which celebrates jokes could not but fall for Hancock. While I travelled to Britain with no aim, I was determined not to marry a foreign girl and turn into a sort of NRI with roots in Stockholm or Vienna. I went to see the world, learn from it, enjoy myself. That is it. I never wavered from that goal. I may have been helped by what I saw. Let me give one example. A casual acquaintance from Ahmedabad, who was a chartered accountant, had married a German girl. He invited me home for a vegetarian dinner. His wife was dressed in a sari which she did not know how to wear or carry. She made bad potato curry, and when her husband went to the toilet, I asked her how she liked wearing Indian clothes. Her reply shocked me. I hate them, she said. When her husband returned, he softened the lights and played sad Mohammed Rafi songs. He was wallowing in VP's nostalgia. I thought, I am never going to let this happen to me. Tennessee William confessed he had survived on the kindness of strangers. I survived on the kindness of a Pakistani called FSMD Bukhari. I lived off him for more years than I care to remember. It was a completely one-sided alliance. Since Bukhari, he sold ready-made clothes from a cart in Kingston Market, made decent money and could rent reasonable lodgings, I always had a comfortable place to live and eat in. Our friendship endured. It endured through the frequent turbulence in India Pakistan relations. During the 1965 war, he and I would quietly watch TV news even as word came in of bloody tank battles on the border and the Indian army marching threateningly towards Lahore. Bukhari came under pressure from Kingston Pakistanis to throw out the enemy, but he stood by me. In the late 80s, I went to meet him at his house in Teddington. He embraced me like a long lost brother. He died 2 years ago in Lahore. I am in touch with his son, who lives in Richmond. I watched the iconic May 1968 student revolt in France from the safe distance of London. The unrest began at the University of Nanterre, then spread to Sorbonne and finally engulfed the entire country. President Charles de Gaulle, who once wondered how it was possible to govern a nation which has 542 varieties of cheese, panicked and later quit. Alas, the student revolt in France quickly turned into a comic spectacle with open and abusive disputes between the student leaders and the trade unions who had temporarily joined hands. By late 1970, my appetite for fun and games had receded. I was missing Lucknow. For financial and sightseeing reasons, I decided to journey back via the land route. The few worldly possessions I accumulated, mostly books and clothes, I packed and sent in advance. With a haversack on my back, I embarked from London to Brussels, to Prague, to Budapest, to Istanbul, to Tehran, to Kabul. I joined a group of hippies on their way to Goa, and the journey through continents compressed hitchhiking, trains, and buses. I had a British passport then, which made visa unnecessary and helped speed things through customs and immigrations. By and large, the 3 week land adventure was uneventful. Only till Kabul. My British passport cut no ice with Pakistani border officials. I had been warned that someone with an Indian name, whatever the color of the passport, would encounter difficulties. So, I took the precaution of submitting my passport along with the bunch forwarded by the hippies. The Pakistani immigration officer picked mine out instantly. Although officially I should have been allowed to travel to Lahore and to Wagah, he rejected my application but gave me a cup of tea. I flew from Kabul to Amritsar and took a train to Lucknow. Thank you very much.